us for coffee.
Sometimes coordinating multiple loads, clients, emails, and accounts becomes confusing and tedious. Introducing TIE TMS, the first all-in-one tool that helps you optimize your freight broker processes. You can send and receive quotes, review the shipment status, and keep control of your invoices all from one single screen. It's easy to manage and utilizes the best integrations. Don't take our word for it, our customers are raving about TIE. With TIE, you can improve your productivity by 75%. Go to tiesoftware.com and get a free demo now.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining for our mid-year freight market update and special edition of Meet Me for Coffee podcast. Obviously, as you saw there, we have a new video that we have been working on. I'm excited to be bringing even more new materials to the Meet Me for Coffee podcast. And that is all in part due to our partnership with TIE TMS. And so very grateful for them and the amazing sponsor that they have been to this podcast for all of 2024. And looking forward to continuing to work and collaborate with them for the rest of this year. So be sure you guys check out TIE TMS if you are in the market for a new TMS software. Also, I have a few more announcements, literally a few, because things are about to get busy with conference season and I'm going to be headed to several of them. And so I just wanted to go ahead and start making you guys all aware. I'll get some links in the comments that you guys can use. Some of them might have some discounts on them for you if you guys are looking to head to any of these conferences. But in order of happenings, we have the Trimble Insight Conference, which is going to be in Las Vegas at the Venetian, September 15th to the 17th. And then I'm going to Chicago for the JOC Inland Conference, which is September 30th to October 7th. And DATCon is also going to be in there in Kansas City, which is my backyard, in October. And so excited to be attending that as well. And then already thinking all the way out to February, but Manifest Las Vegas, we already have people registering. People have already been registering through our Meet Me for Coffee link. So thank you so much to anyone who's been checking that out. That will be back at the Venetian in Las Vegas, February 10th to the 12th. Highly recommend a lot of these shows. If you have questions around which one's best suited for you based on your purposes, the people you're looking to network or speak with, please just reach out and ask me questions. Happy to give an honest recommendation to the ones that I think would fit you guys best. So without further ado, we have a lot going on today. We also have 4 guests instead of 1. And so I'm going to have my producer start adding them in here. And we're going to do some introductions this morning. But gentlemen, thank you so much for making time and joining our mid-year update.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. We're going to start, as I see you guys on my screen, with introductions. So we'll go Jason, David, Ken, Cody. If you guys just want to give a quick introduction of who you are and what you do, and then we'll jump into some questions.
Hi, everybody. Jason Miller, Eli Brogue, Professor of Supply Chain Management at Michigan State University.
How's it going? David Spencer, the Vice President of Market Intelligence at Arrive Logistics.
I'm Ken Adamo. I'm Chief of Analytics over here at DAT, and I also head up our strategy and corp dev functions as well.
And I'm Cody Thacker. I'm the Senior Director of Fleet Operations for Refrigerated Food Express.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And if anyone's joining for the first time, my name's Samantha. I'm the host of Meet Me for Coffee, the owner of Samantha Jones Consulting, and I am privileged to be here and learn from all of these gentlemen. So Ken and Jason were on our freight market update that we had in January. We had a panel, and so we wanted to bring them back. They've both been on the show twice now, so this is their 3rd appearance each. David's been on our show before. Cody is a first-time guest. Very grateful for him to be joining us. But I wanted to start by reviewing some things that were said on January's episode. We made some kind of predictions around what we thought was going to be happening in the first half of 2024. And so I wanted to revisit those and just real quickly verify if they have or have not kind of come to fruition. And so I'm going to put Jason in the hot seat and remind him what he said in January. Jason, you said that in February, we would be getting data on the holiday spending cycle. We'll see what that says. You said that we would continue to watch spot prices relative to contract to look for noticeable changes. we would be watching the outbound tender rejection index from FreightWaves to see if we saw any progress there. And then you said that you think it's a demand story, and unfortunately you were not projecting to see any noticeable changes in the first 6 months of 2024 when it comes to freight demand. So I just thought I would revisit real quick and get your thoughts on that, and if you think that that's kind of still the case, and how that prediction has held up so far in the first half of 2024.
Yeah, I mean, I still think it is a demand story right now. We just got the industrial production index data for May, and some sectors are looking like they're doing a little bit better, like plastic products. Motor vehicles is still really strong. But just in general, it still seems that, freight demand is certainly not where it was in 2022. Capacity is still not leaving, and the type of exit that we would need to really flip the market seems like we have maybe a little bit more of a return to seasonality. If you look at FreightWaves where their outbound tender rejection rates are, it's perfectly tracking 2019, but that was a very soft year. And you look at spot rates, looking at DAT's data that just was updated today, we've had, I believe a 6 cent per mile increase, including fuel surcharge on the dry van side since the April low, but we're still down 3 cents year over year right now. So it's still, in general, we're not seeing anything meaningfully change. And June's a peak freight month, and so July is substantially less. The auto plants will produce 15% fewer motor vehicles. Peak beverage season is this month right now, so it doesn't seem the demand has returned in the manner that I think a lot of folks expected.
Okay, we'll talk more about what's going on right now, but I would say that I think those predictions held up pretty well so far. So we'll have you make some more today and hope for the same at the end of the year. Ken, you echoed some of his thoughts in January, so I didn't want to be too repetitive there, but you did mention that there had been a lot of kind of tension and animosity between brokers and carriers that we had been seeing in the marketplace, and that broker margins were low and pretty compressed, and brokers had been stressed on those margins. And you also mentioned that brokers had gained a much larger portion of contract freight volumes in the last few years, and that they would be working harder to retain those under pressure. And so I'm just curious if you've seen anything as far as have brokers retained that market position? Has that started to shift more back towards asset carriers, or less contract, more spot for the brokers? Or is it too early to tell so far in the year?
I think it's a little too early to tell. I mean, we just revised our long-term projection. We think that share growth probably is going to steady out at 1 to 2 percentage points over the next several years. Keep in mind, they gained in some sectors up to 5 to 6 percentage points of share in the routing guide during COVID. So that's certainly normalized back to reality. From a margin pressure standpoint, this is the absolute worst time in the cycle for brokerage gross margins, especially as rates started to climb a bit seasonally. We're seeing that short-term pinch. You had your late winter, early spring bid season. Those rates went into the routing guide, either flat or a slight discount. You're covering them a little bit higher in the spot market right now, which are pinching margins. So I think you're going to continue to see. My expectation is, not to spoil things for the second half of your show, I think you're going to start to see carrier exits slow, if not slowing already. But I think there's still some damage to be done in terms of brokerage exits, just given the volumes and margins that exist out there today.
Right. Okay. Well, we're going to jump into some questions now for today, now that we revisited what happened in January. These are going to be an open style conversation, gentlemen. So I might direct it to someone initially, and then I would love for you guys to all go ahead and jump in. And so just want to go ahead, and obviously I was intentional with who I had on today. We have David, who is very much in tune with economics, freight markets, but also represents a brokerage viewpoint here on our show. And then we have Cody, who is similar to David, represents the asset side and the operations of carriers in this market, and is also very in tune with what's going on. And then, of course, we have our freight market experts here with Ken and Jason. So, gentlemen, let's go ahead. I'm just going to keep this one pretty broad, but how has the 2024 truckload market been so far for the first 6 months of the year? What are some key takeaways? What are some things we're noticing? Any trends, any ways that it lived up to your expectations or maybe surprised you in others? And we're just going to kind of keep that broad, but I'd like to hear from each of you on your different viewpoints for kind of what you've taken away thus far in 24.
Sure. I guess I can jump in, given Ken and Jason already kind of kicked us off with their thoughts. But yeah, I mean, not a whole lot to add. I think I'd add, just, second on top of what they've said here is the market's been relatively stable out there, right? I think Jason alluded to tender rejection rates trending a little bit closer to 2019 levels. So on a year-over-year basis, higher and a little bit more of a spike in line with normal seasonal, demand surges. But we haven't exactly seen that equate to meaningful rate movements, et cetera, right? So to me, that's probably a sign of where contract rates have come down to overall, and that competitiveness of contract rates and spot rates today being a little bit tighter than we were a year ago, right? So you're causing a little bit more shipper challenges when it comes to contract compliance around some of these seasonal demand surges. But that's really it, right? Not seeing a whole lot of other signs of life in the market today. I'd largely agree with both Ken and Jason's sentiment about the first half overall.
Yeah, for me, I would say that, all three of these guys have been spot on with what we're experiencing on the carrier side. It's been very challenging. As expected, the market's been flat for a long time. What I will say operationally, we've seen a high premium on incumbency from direct shippers. So, just being an asset, it hasn't necessarily opened up the doors that maybe it historically has. So the sales cycle has been extremely drawn out. We've seen kind of a shift in customer pricing where, historically speaking, we see a lot of maybe 6 month to 12-month cycles. We're seeing shorter, maybe 3 to 6 month cycles where shippers are more able to capture real-time pricing. And then we're also seeing some challenges on our routing guide customers where if we were positioned a little bit further down the waterfall, we're not seeing volumes that maybe we anticipated seeing. So it's really, I think from a planning perspective on our side, it's been extremely challenging and has forced us to really look at what we're doing and make some, plan B decisions.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, I've learned a lot about carrier operations when I worked in brokerage, but it always amazes me how much more complex it is to make sure you don't have that flexibility. You have to make sure that you are positioning your equipment when and where it's needed and keeping it turning. So I can definitely understand that when we're talking about routing guides and incumbency. I also was speaking with someone just yesterday at a brokerage, and they echoed something similar. And I've been hearing this, and so I'll bring it up and open this question up to you guys as well. Incumbency seems maybe to not be counting as much, I would say, to shippers. If there is an offer still on the table in 2024 to take a 5 to 10% decrease to if they are leaving their incumbents, seems to be an appetite to consider that right now. And so I was speaking with someone who said, we wouldn't agree to concede to that. We don't believe that those rates are going to be sustainable for the next 6 to 12 months. We don't believe essentially that the people taking those pricing are actually able to make a profit at that rate. But they were kind of saying that they feel it's a necessary evil at this point to allow those rates to go into effect, because with, like we've kind of said, maybe not so much of a large demand stimulus coming this year, maybe it's going to have to be that rate pressure that starts to kind of disrupt routing guides and makes things a little bit more uncomfortable. So just curious what your guys, if anyone has any thoughts to chime in there, is it kind of part of this cycle where we're going to maybe ultimately it helps the cycle move along if we're seeing these unsustainable rates start going into place in routing guides, or is this really a non-issue?
I think this is the time in the cycle where a lot of bad decisions are made, on all sides of the coin, right? You're going to have brokers and carriers pricing out of desperation to win freight they won't be able to cover in 3 to 4 months. And then you're going to have shippers with really, really, really bad short-term memories and long-term memories even that are going to chase the dollar down and then get burned when all that freight gets turned back, right? So I think one wrinkle in this cycle that I would watch out for is brokerages especially could afford to float these losses while the market corrected before when money was free. Given the stretching of payment terms and the cost of money right now, I don't think they're going to be as willing to float kind of idiosyncratic pricing very, very long. So you might see the turnbacks happen faster because they're not willing to float that loss. But again, this is bad decision-making abounds in a market trough. So that's kind of how I would explain this.
I mean, from our perspective, the brokerage side, it depends on the shipper, largely to what you're saying, Ken, right? I think there's still shippers out there that value, high levels of service, and they're going to pay the appropriate price for that, right? I think, to kind of keep things short here, for those of you that in the shipper community are wondering, what is a sustainable level of pricing? I mean, look to your rate APIs as a good indicator of where that pricing is today and where that floor is and where that's been over the second quarter here, because we've seen rates here along the floor for a while, right? So I wouldn't go too much lower than what you guys are seeing, day to day or week to week, especially slower times here in your APIs, and use that as a good benchmark for really what is sustainable pricing. But at this point in the cycle, you're an incumbent for a reason. That's because you provided an elite level of service, right? So generally speaking, we're still seeing preferential treatment for customers we provided high levels of service to, but certainly there are those shippers out there that, like Ken said, have very short memories.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, like the floor on brokerage pricing versus the floor on asset pricing are slightly different. And I think that we have reached the floor on asset pricing with the cost to run equipment. So I do think, and I mean, we've been guilty of this too, if we know there's a segment of our business that we're covering via brokerages, and say an opportunity to cover those, that open capacity with the direct shipper, albeit it may be a slightly indesirable rate or a rate equal to what we would maybe charge a brokerage, but to get it direct, we may make that decision specifically if the characteristics around the freight are advantageous.
Sure.
So, but I think that you're going to see carriers be a little bit more disciplined, I would hope, with regards to the rates we're putting on the page, because most of us have fixed costs and we know what those are.
Yes. Wow. That last sentence there, Cody, I'm not sure all carriers know their fixed costs and operate like that, but I definitely believe that you guys do. And that's something that I was discussing with a very small fleet the other day, is that, a lot of the, if even the owner operators are hurting with some of these spot rates, absolutely. When we've seen these mid-sized fleets, you guys aren't, like you said, your floor is different than what we're seeing right now in a lot of the broker spaces. Jason, you look like maybe you had a thought to add to that. Anything there?
I mean, other than this is what a market does. I think you always are going to get players that are going to be short-sighted. And I think the one challenge that I always have with this idea that rates are going to be driven so sustainable, it's going to force exit on a widespread basis, is just for the most part, somebody's head haul is somebody else's back haul. Sure. And you can price accordingly with that. And so I think, Cody, you were alluding to that right there with how the discussion of, the brokerage versus the asset-based pricing piece. And so, again, what I would keep saying is I think it's, what will turn the market is a change in demand. It's not necessarily too much supply exiting. There's not one recorded instance in modern freight history of that happening.
Right. Well, I'm going to go ahead then and use that as a lead into my next very open-ended question for you gentlemen, which is, what do you guys think will be the outcome of the second half of 2024? What changes or patterns or anything do you expect to see happening in the freight market or the macro economy for the remainder of the year?
I think where we sit today, literally today, it's the first time we've been flat to maybe like a half a penny above year over year from a dry van spot rate perspective in 25 months, 26 months. So no, there's going to be some noise there. We're going to see some thrash in that number over the next several weeks as we get to the 4th of July. So my guess is it's going to be at a higher level, something that closely mirrors a year like 2016. where we saw a return to seasonality a bit, and then volume building into the fall, leading up to the Christmas. But the thing that I think is continuing to perplex a lot of folks is what's going to happen with interest rates. We went from a year ago thinking there's going to be 4 cuts this year to then 3 and then 2, and then are we even going to, like, depending on who you ask and what Wall Street analysts you talk to, some of them think the market's pricing in 1 increase and decrease, and some think it's pricing in 2. I think continues to be the wild card, as inflation continues to be a bit sticky. So that, I think
that's the wild card this year, or do you think a single rate cut or 2 rate cuts is going to have that type of demand impact?
I mean, I think it would have certainly an impact as we get into the fall with consumer durables.
We missed our window because home building season, we're already at peak. I mean, housing starts peak in May and June. And so if we would have had a rate cut in March, that would have changed the picture substantially, because you would have seen a substantial surge in housing activity. Because every time mortgage rates dip down, there's a surge of home buying. And houses that go on the market sell really fast right now. So to me, you've got a very consequential presidential election coming up, from an economic standpoint, I don't see anything really happening this year. I think we continue along the bottom of this trough where we're at, and we have to wait and see what 25 brings. And there could be competing forces because, we may see interest rate cuts, but if we get a 10% global tariff and 60% tariff on products from China, there may be a surge of imports while we wait till that kicks effect, but then we will have a nasty freight recession on the other side of that, because domestic manufacturing will get hammered and the ag sector will get just annihilated with retaliatory tariffs.
Well, that sounded very positive. David, did you have anything else to add to that as well?
Yeah, no, I think if you just look at what we've seen through this summer peak season, right, I'd say pretty muted. Yes, we're getting into a little bit of a pickup here this week, certainly seeing some tightening, especially yesterday and today. We'd expect to see that in the lead up to end of month quarter and 4th of July holiday anyway, but nothing that screams, hey, we're seeing something abnormal happening, right? And we alluded to rejection rate levels, the gap between spot and contract rates being still, depending on which indexes you're looking at, historically very high. And so there's just not a lot of vulnerability in the market, right? Yes, we're looking at a potentially active storm season. Ken mentioned interest rate improvements. I tend to lean towards it's going to take several rate cuts before that really kicks in fully for us. And so I kind of lean towards that middle of next year being kind of that target area of when we'd expect to see really true vulnerability to any kind of normal disruptive event out there or demand changes, as Jason's alluded to it as.
Right.
I would agree with all that.
Go ahead, Cody.
No, I would just say outside, with me, we're predominantly refrigerated. Outside of, the seasonal impacts that, Jason hit on, and then what David just hit on, potentially an active, weather season, I think it's going to be business as usual. We're not anticipating, being able to get any type of significant rate increases, whether it be on new shippers or incumbent accounts.
And Cody, you guys, I know that you guys are in the refrigerated space. I don't know how much maybe you guys do in the produce space, or at least just being in the reefer market. I've kind of heard that, there's been a little bit of like a tightening in capacity in some of the produce markets, but that produce like volumes are a little bit elevated from last year, but not like notably so, because last year was kind of a down year for produce. So have you guys just seen anything in like the reefer markets really that would say that this has been an abnormal peak or season for volumes?
So what I would say is we focus a little bit more predominantly on like prepackaged year-round freight with our trucks, but we do land in some seasonal markets, say South Georgia, Central Florida, with consistency. And we have seen some premiums there. It's been extremely easy to move our equipment. And again, just speaking to kind of those seasonal peaks, a couple of days, it's very short. It's a very short window where, we are able to capitalize on that, but it's not, I wouldn't say that we're getting an overwhelming abundance of inbound phone calls or, connections from brokers desperate for capacity. I would say the rates are fair, but somewhat negotiable. But again, it's not maybe what we've seen in the past in terms of variance on rates from normal to like a peak season rate.
Sure.
Do you think this heat dome that we're in the Midwest and coming into New England will drive some more reefer freight above and beyond what you typically see this time of year?
It could.
It's hot. It's hot.
And I think, like, again, the temperature is what we don't talk enough about. Just even, and this sounds dorky, but the pressure that it puts on the equipment. I mean, we have seen, some instances where we've had to put equipment in the shop, whether it be the truck or the trailer, because of the temperature. So it does present challenges, but I don't think that it's anything that we actively, I guess, discuss within our decision making. We're not as transactional as a lot of fleets our size. So, it's not something that we pick up on maybe as quickly as a smaller carrier who has, trucks in Indianapolis that they're putting into the market daily.
Yeah. I had one last question on the rate cuts, and then Trace just asked a question that said, what will a 1/4 point rate cut do? When you guys were talking about that, I was going to ask a question for myself. I know that when I was first trying to understand the increases in these rate hikes, maybe it was Jason who said that there's sometimes like up to a 6-month lag where they go into effect, the increase goes into effect, but we don't see the results of that increase the next week or the next month. And sometimes it takes time for those to really like show up in the economy. Are cuts different? Is there a lag when we're making cuts, or is it more instantaneous just because people know that there's some type of positivity coming in, and financial institutions, do they react quicker to that than they do the increases?
All the data shows there's still a lag, and it can be some of the original estimates. Now, these dated from 1980s, looking at all the data back to that time, but it was, up to 20 months to receive the full impact. That's why a lot of the rules of thumb we're now just finally sort of, we still, by that argument, haven't fully absorbed the Fed raising rates yet. We still may have a few more months. Probably the most comparative cycle that we all have to look back to was 1994, when the Fed had really hammered interest rates down in response to the 1991 recession. And then they had to really start raising them rapidly because the economy started overheating really badly. And we didn't go into any type of recession, but it took a while. I mean, freight activity slowed substantially in 95 and 96, and it didn't really start rising again until 97, and had a great 3-year run before the great offshoring recession began and things fell apart.
The only thing I'd add is if you listen to the Fed, they're being very patient, right, with coming back with a cut. I think a 1/4 point might not do something, but it could do something more if the general public perceives that as being the end of the peak. But I will say one of the cautions we're advising is that if they do start to cut rates, it might be not necessarily a good thing, because that's probably based upon some pretty bad economic data that might be existing about what's happening with the economy. So what you might see from a gain in the inflationary aspect of declining rates, you may see pullbacks in other areas as a result of what might be happening in the economy. So, we're not solely focused on that as being a driver of positive momentum in the freight market, although it very well could.
Right.
I think a couple things to just kind of poke on a little bit, right? So we're seeing, and Jason can maybe correct me where I err here, we're seeing 5-year highs of consumer debt, right, on credit cards and revolvers. And we're seeing delinquency rates on credit cards at a 5-year high. So I think those are two things. I mean, the pressure is rising for the American consumer as it pertains to the short-term debt vehicles. And I think that, I also think, let's not let Jerome Powell off the hook here, right? I mean, I don't think I have not read a real positive, outside of partisan politics, positive review of his handling of the current inflationary crisis, if you will. For the first year and a half of it, the Fed refused to admit that inflation was anything but transitory. So I don't, color me a little bit pessimistic if I have too much faith in the current Fed administration to be able to navigate us through digging out of the mess that's essentially been created.
Yeah. And I would actually add to that, just from some research that went into my last newsletter publication, that there's a lot of people who are saying that the market is just starting to cool down, that like consumer spending is going to maybe start slowing more. And like a lot of economists who aren't in the freight space are saying that like we still are kind of going to wind down a little bit more. And maybe like you said, because we're seeing kind of this exhaustion start to really take hold amongst consumers and the demand side. So I've kind of been in this position of I don't know that demand stimulus returns this year or even early 25 if we still have people saying that things might have to cool down and maybe get even a little bit worse in the macroeconomy before they get better necessarily. So I'm kind of with you on some of the pessimism there, Ken, I think. All right, I have some questions. I got one for each of you guys. We're going to start with David and then Cody, because we're going to talk a little bit about what we think is going on for brokers and carriers. So David, what do you anticipate being a primary area of focus for brokers for the rest of the year? And what are some things that brokers need to be thinking about and doing to position for 2025? Because at this point, we're halfway through 24. We've made some pretty boring predictions for the rest of this year. But if we start thinking about 2025 now, what should be top of mind?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, RFP season coming up here as we get into the fourth quarter, that's going to be extremely important for every broker to focus on. It's going to be a challenging time, right? We're at the point in the cycle where we're experiencing a lot of pressure from shippers. We talked about it earlier around, assets. Cody just mentioned it, trying to go in and get direct with shippers and work around the brokers, right? So everything you can do to remain really sticky with your shippers right now. That's quality service, meeting with them on how they want to be worked with and focusing on being a partner of choice. That's certainly everything you can do right now to put yourself in the best position possible to go into those conversations around RFP season and understand what is it going to take to maintain business or even grow your share with that shipper. And then likewise, in terms of preparing for the inflationary cycle, you want to still be in the market with these shippers, right? Because a lot of times access to spot boards, et cetera, comes with being part of a contract relationship with them. So staying involved with them contractually is very important. And then on the carrier side of things, eventually it's not going to be easy to pick up the phone and get a hold of these carriers and get them to talk to you about their network, right, when the market flips. So take advantage of the time right now to continue to prospect and build those relationships with carriers out there, especially in a network that matches where your shippers move freight, right? Now's the time to be building capacity for what might be coming, 9 to 12 months from now in terms of a market flip. So from a brokerage standpoint, outside of executing every day like we try to, that's the best advice I can give on a forward-looking basis.
Awesome. Thank you. Cody, I have pretty much the same question for you. What do you anticipate being the primary area of focus for asset carriers and fleets for the rest of 2024 to navigate this market and then to better prepare for 2025 as well?
Yeah, so I'm always hesitant to give other motor carriers advice on how they should run their business, because I think what I've seen is on the asset side, everybody's business is it's different. Brokerages tend to, you pick up freight, you deliver freight, and you have some value add services. On our side, it's slightly different. So I think like my message would be control what we control and really focus on the efficiency gains within our fleets. So what I mean by that is, we're going to be, really scrutinizing the commitments that we make. We're going to have a very keen eye on the next wave of pricing, the RFP season that David mentioned. Really want to put a premium on the velocity of our equipment, not getting stuck at, extended dwell times. There's also a very strong push on driver retention, new driver acquisition. And then I would also say that something that this market has done for us is it's also kind of reset the equipment market. So peak COVID, I mean, there were trucking companies buying other trucking companies just for the power units and the trailers because you couldn't find, a trailer within 400 miles of Atlanta. So, looking at your equipment cost, recognizing if there's opportunities to get into better leased equipment or, maybe newer owned equipment, looking at your trailer deals, Something else that we're doing is, and it's kind of contradictory, we're refrigerated food express, but modal diversification. When you get into a down market like this, I have a few dry vans. I've got some flatbeds. I've got reefers. They all run it. There's a different rate floor for each piece of equipment. And in doing so, it's enabled us to, I guess, in theory, raise that bottom line on our rate per mile for miles driven. And that's definitely helped us. So if that's an opportunity for you as an asset, I would definitely recommend that. Outside of that, it's minimizing deadhead. It's the dwell. It's even stuff as simple as your paperwork process, how you get your signed bill of lading from your driver into your TMS to work an invoice without having to be touched by a half a dozen people or the load planner. So, again, for me, I've learned over time to kind of, again, focus on the things that we can control, not the things that we can't. And that's definitely where we're at right now.
Yeah, that was all really good. But I really like what you said, as simple as how you're collecting PODs, and something that I've been hearing people talk about is, what are we doing right now internally within brokerages and carrier fleets to make sure that we're optimizing your operational processes, so that not just for right now, so that you're running more efficiently, but when volumes do return, or you start being able to take on higher volumes, are you in a place where you now have implemented, say, technology or more efficient processes that allow you to start taking on volumes without taking on people, so that you're actually able to realize more profits and higher margins, because your operational costs don't just start increasing as soon as the volumes start to increase. So I think that's just something that I've been following and listening to some certain companies out there that I think offer unique solutions to both brokers and carriers, as far as doing more with less and empowering your people to be more productive in their operational days.
I'd agree with that. And I would just say, like what you just said, the technology that's flowing through the asset side of the business over the last 5 years, the leaps and bounds that have been made, some of the stuff, I had no idea even existed, so it's I think that's where the successful motor carriers in a down market focus their efforts, really on the soft cost.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, they're the fixed costs, right? Too,
Fixed,
like
yes.
how, those things, of course, but that's what I'm saying. Like your head count and how many people it takes and how many touches it takes to execute on a shipment all go into what ultimately you have a way to calculate what that revenue per hour or rate per mile should be. So it's all part of it. And that's where, when you say focus on what you can control, this is a great time to be really cleaning up house internally for brokers and carriers. We've been saying that for a long time, of course, but I think that continues to be a very solid piece of advice. Okay, we do have a couple questions. I actually, I was reading what Scott just said there about wage growth. Thought I'd ask you real quick on that. Maybe David or Jason, on wage growth is increasing more than unemployment over the most recent reporting periods. That mostly bodes well for consumer spending. So I did want to ask kind of if either of you have some more updated thoughts on wage growth, because I know that we've been seeing, obviously the very strong labor market was a big driver of inflation, but we've kind of been seeing some cooling in the labor market space. And so I don't think that we're necessarily seeing like a continued increase in consumer spending, but correct me if I'm wrong there.
Yeah, I mean, if you take the retail sales data today, adjusted for inflation, for the CPI for all commodities, it's basically flat. I mean, we've trended up a little bit from kind of the low point in 2023, which was sort of the most recent low point. But, again, I kind of agree with Ken on this. I think you're going to see more caution with consumers. It does appear the delinquency rate on credit card debt's probably starting to get near a plateau. But it certainly is higher than what it was in 2018 or 2019 and far above where it was in 2021. I keep going back and looking at what I'm going to call freight-centric sectors of trucking that we tend not to think about. And it's, paper manufacturing still down 10% from where it was in 2022. Or non-metallic mineral products, so making things like cement and concrete blocks and gypsum and clay refractories. That sector's is down 8% year over year right now. And so I always look and say trucking demand is much more industrial than we tend to think. And the industrial side of the economy is still not doing well. So even if consumer spending is okay, it's not going to bring us out of this. And the last couple freight cycles, we've had sectors like fracking. We've literally dug our way out of poor economic conditions. We certainly did in 2011 through 2014. We're not fracking like we used to, and we never are going to again. The economics have changed. And so when you start taking a look at, a lot of the headwinds right now, farmers are going to be making much less profit this year than what they have the past couple of years. That's less ag equipment. We're already seeing John Deere laying folks off. So it's just hard to get excited when you look at this industrial economy that feels a lot like 2015 or 2016. And it's going to take a substantial amount of time for us to get out of that. We're talking 12-month cycle at least, even if things start looking better today.
Yeah. And again, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but last I checked, I believe consumer spending is in a healthy place. I mean, I think as far as like what we would expect in trend lines and growth, like we're tracking where we think we should be tracking. It's not like we're seeing suppressed consumer spending. It's just that even if, the volumes are up or right where they should be, we also still have, like we've been talking about, plenty of capacity in our marketplace to handle that. So I think it feels different than what the reality is. And that I think people feel like things are down or we must not be spending as much and we're going to start spending more. I don't think that's the case. I think we've been spending pretty strong amounts and that goods have been flowing very healthily. We just aren't as healthy in the trucking space, it doesn't feel like, because there is ample capacity to eat up those volumes. And so I don't think it's that we're seeing like low numbers that we're expecting this growth in. I think the numbers have been fine. Is that fairly accurate?
I think the problem is like it could be a wall type effect, right? Like I think we were spending just fine heading into the 2008 Great Recession, right? I think it's just you get to a point where how are you financing that spending? Are you paying in cash? Are you putting it on a card? Are you paying your credit cards down? Are you floating the interest? And also, like you might be like, I think a lot of this stuff you need to think about at the individual level. Like your spending might be totally normal until you get called into HR's office on a Friday and you lost your job. Then your spending on Monday is going to be a lot different, right? So I think these things. I think the velocity of the economy. I don't know what the right term is. Jason can maybe come up with a new term and trademark it and give me a little credit. But like the velocity of the consumer, I think is faster. But I also think like there's speed bumps that lay out there that we can't see right now, and we may or may not hit them, but. I think the consumer, like we tend to use the word resilient. Economists love to talk about like, well, the consumer is extremely resilient. I think that what it means is like, maybe we're just like foolhardy a bit right now. We're all spending because there's really all of the words we learned in business school have no meaning anymore. Like what's a recession? Certainly what I learned twice in business school doesn't hold any matter. Like we're redefining what a recession is. Yeah. So like, who knows?
Okay. Question, Ken, you were next up on my docket, so I'll ask you another question. Thank you for your input there. What DAT data points should brokers and carriers be paying attention to understand how the market is moving and or not moving?
I mean, I think you got the classics, right? I mean, I'm looking at kind of like a 3 to 5. I use a 3-5 approach or a 3-7 approach to long-term, short-term rates. If you're trying to price freight, right now, as you get into bid season, as David said, now's the time to start leveraging some rate forecasting tools. I always recommend there's no one answer. If anyone selling you freight products tells you that their solution is the answer and you don't have to do anything with it, I promise you they're wrong. I'm not saying they're lying to you because they just might not know any better, but there is no like silver bullet in this space. You have to blend your experience, your own data, and external data sources to create your best view of the market, because David's view of the market at Arrive could be completely different than his counterpart at Coyote or Echo or CH or brokerage XYZ. So I think having a pretty good forward-looking view of the market is going to be solid. I think this is a point in the market where a lot of these capacity indicators, whether it's our MCI or load to truck, whether it's FreightWays' indicators, they all kind of fail you because they're at a level where it's like, what is routing guide compliance right now? Near 100%. It effectively, the outbound tender rejection index effectively rounds to 0 right now. Like, I don't know that you're going to glean much between 4.9 and 5.1. Like, what does that actually tell you? You know what I mean? It's not picking at their data. It's just, I think once that starts to go up and approach maybe 10%, 12%, 13%, or once our load to truck ratio starts to really reach up, that's when I think you start to extract meaningful signal there. But I think right now it's easy to find a truck. That's kind of all you really need to know. David, tell me if I'm wrong, but.
No, I mean, I think it takes we look at the rate of change of these metrics, right? So yeah, like a 9% rejection rate or whatever, right? That's something very different than if a week ago it was 3 and a week versus a week ago it was 15, right? So you got to be paying attention to these data points and how they're changing. Largely, I'd agree. I mean, just to speak to DAT's data, since that was the question, we're looking at we like to look at how your loaded truck ratios change, but that gap between spot and contract rates at a national level, I think historically has been really important. So that would be the DAT data point that we pay most attention to in understanding market vulnerability.
Yeah, I'll add one thing, and then I'll stop bogarting the conversation. We're noticing a unique trend that carrier posting activity doesn't resemble traditionally what you'd expect given the number of carriers in the network. Now, everyone on this call's favorite freight conspiracy theorist likes to postulate why that might be. But in actuality, it's the same number of carriers. They're just posting less. And there's a bunch of reasons we've essentially sussed out. A lot of it has to do with they're getting spammed right when they post their truck. They're getting just a bunch of inbound calls, dispatching companies. They're being more selective. They're doing a ton more searching than posting. So I guess I bring all of this up to say, like, these metrics evolve as behavior changes. I think as we settle into the new normal, we're going to have to reset some of our benchmark and our baselines across the board on what a load to truck ratio looks like, what an outbound tender rejection look like, and as spot and contract becomes more blurred, that difference, I think, is going to have to be studied in perhaps a different way as that access to the spot market becomes more fluid.
I agree with a lot of that. I think part of what you just touched on there too will kind of lend to some of these comments that we're getting around questions around some fraud. So I do want to get to the questions in the comments. I have one more for Jason, and then we're going to spend a few minutes on the viewers' questions. Jason, if you want to kind of quickly give us some thoughts on what areas of the macro economy will be most important to keep an eye on for the remainder of 2024 to kind of just gauge the health of the macro economy and also try to decide if there is any potential for a demand stimulus coming from any of those factors.
Yeah, so really the one sector, manufacturing, that's still been doing very, very well is motor vehicle production. I mean, we've been at record levels consistently over the last year, other than the auto strike last fall. If we start to see signs that production in that sector is slowing, and that sector is very responsive to where downstream demand is at, that would be for me the sort of the trigger that, okay, consumer spending is indeed really going to pull back. If people are not buying vehicles like they were, I mean, that has always been a very pro-cyclical sector. So that's one I'm really looking at. And thinking about just the overall sort of health of the U.S., trucking freight economy, do we start to see things like the normal seasonal production in food manufacturing? Like, we are producing 3% less food today than we were 2 years ago. That may not seem like much, but when food production produces 20 million truckloads a year, you take 2% out of that. That is a whole lot of truckloads. So watching that, seeing if we are indeed on the containerized import side, seeing a little bit of an early peak season. My hunch is we are. I think the 2024 will finally rewrite the year where folks realize that containerized imports are not what drives most trucking volumes. I think we've had a major industry misunderstanding of the role of containerized freight. And this year is finally going to break that, because you've got double-digit year-over-year gains, but flat, if not down, freight volumes. So that's kind of where I'm at. I don't see housing changing substantially. I think 2024 is going to be 2016 essentially all over again. It's just a flat year. And then the question is, what does 2025 look like?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for all of these thoughts. We're going to go ahead and get to some questions that we have from the audience, and then we'll see where that puts us on time. I'm thinking maybe I want to kick this one off to Cody or David. Chris asked if panelists would care to comment on the rash of brokerage scammers that took place. Is this starting to calm down, and is this more under control now? I was thinking about this comment when Ken mentioned, truck postings not being as common. And I think that large in part, that's probably due to like the more information you put out there, that higher likelihood you have of a scammer or a double broker trying to get a hold of you. So, Cody, I'll kind of send this to you first. As a carrier, have you guys seen this kind of calm down more, or is the issue still as prevalent? What's kind of going on?
So it's interesting. So our information, we try to keep extremely secure. We don't want our stuff out there, right? We don't post our equipment. We try to keep our data in-house. But I think like where I could add some insight on this is how we interact with brokerages and how brokerages are interacting with carriers with regards to this. And what I will say is, like 5 years ago, I could call into pretty much any brokerage, give them my MC number, tell them my name, agree on a rate, book the load, get the rate confirmation sent to a Yahoo account, a Gmail account, wherever I needed it sent, right? Whereas today there's definitely an extra level of care or compliance, safeguard by the good brokerages. I'm not saying everybody does this, but the real names that you recognize are very good at protecting this information and making certain that we prove we are who we say they are. So good job on that, David.
Yeah,
because what I'll say is it's frustrating at times. Like speaking specifically to myself, we have other fleets within the larger fleet of our company, and getting the right contact information at times it can be a challenge, and my guys will get frustrated. But the reality is, it's all there to protect everybody. So I respect it.
Yeah.
Well, I certainly appreciate that introduction. I mean, to say that that's over with or fading, I think is foolish, right? We're at a time where, you're increased risk of information security, et cetera, fraud, theft. All you can do is continue to figure out the ways that these scammers exist and what they're trying to do to either penetrate your systems or get behind any kind of your processes and put up, the best defense that you can across the board and to prevent these and whatever that might mean, right? That might mean, diverting away from traditional methods of sourcing capacity, and what information you're willing to put out there. That may mean you have to take some of those stances at times. But like I said, I think to have the opinion that this is going to go away, I think is foolish. And I think everyone needs to continue to have their guard up, 100% of the time here. And a lot of the decreased risk comes from knowing who you're partnering with and knowing who you're working with. If you've done hundreds of loads with people in the past, it's the same contact, you're probably going to be okay. Introducing new people into your network, that's where you really have to be careful.
Right.
Let me add to that. So, I think that was a really interesting point that you made, and you hit on it when you were talking a little bit ago against, carrier sales and properly vetting the carriers. And it's like, I think that, what we do see, we're not seeing as many carriers go through those processes that you mentioned, where they're really trying to understand the carrier business. And I feel like in a down market, it can allow some potential bad habits to creep into the carrier sales, because it is easy to find a truck, right? It might not be, they might be able to save 100, 200 to use somebody they don't know versus using that repeat carrier. And it's always that like tug of war with regards to what's the right play in that type of scenario. And so it's interesting hearing your take on that.
No, I appreciate it.
I think it's an excellent point. It's certainly running rampant. I think the industry as a whole has maybe gotten some of their arms around it, right? Because it's a combination of, this has never been like white glove chip manufacturing industry. I mean, there's fraud. Newsflash, if you've been in this industry for any amount of time, you know that fraud's been here, right, as long as the industry has existed, even before deregulation. People were cutting the hinges off of trucks and stealing. I mean, just watch Goodfellas, right? The Lufthansa heist. But I think what's new is the targeted cybersecurity kind of led hack in, get phished, commandeer your DAT or truck stop or a REFE account, I don't know if that happens. I'm assuming it does. And then infiltrate, and then you've essentially got network access, right? I think that's been the new piece. I'll say the counter lever to that, though, is people can afford to be picky right now. Like we talk to tons of brokers. They're setting their thresholds ultra high, and they're still getting great cost, great service. So I talked to a broker yesterday that had no carrier that's had their authority under a year would be onboarded. You wouldn't have moved any freight during the peak of COVID if that's how picky you were being. You wouldn't have onboarded a single new carrier. And you wouldn't have grown. So I think like this is going to test the metal, right? Because it's easy for everyone now to say we've forever changed. We're only hiring the best of the best carriers into our network. But I promise you in 2025 or 2026, you're going to be faced with a situation where you're like, this carrier's based in a virtual address in Glendale. Their authority is 8 days old. And they don't.
But they have a truck and can move it.
But I've got like a $3,000 load that's only going, 400 miles, and I really want to move it. It's a new shipper. It's a new logo. Bet you hire that carrier.
I think that's a very good point, Ken, that everyone is really getting almost a little preachy on how strict they are on their standards and how we don't work with these people. But the reality is they're not having any issues finding people that meet all those qualifications right now. And so I do think that's an excellent call out, is that we'll see where those standards stay when the market does change or when conditions are different. And I also just think that, to your point about the cybersecurity, like what I just tell people is, no, I don't think we're going to see, like David said, we'd be foolish to think we're through this, because it's going to be constantly evolving. And it used to be like everything was about double brokers. And I don't really hear as much about that now because people kind of figured that one out. But now I hear about a small carrier, a 15 truck carrier, who their DAT account was hacked and someone was posting loads through like their account or trucks. And then they were running freight, but sending in different carriers. And it all happened and was caught and fixed in a matter of 24 hours. But there were still 2 loads picked up through that process. And so then like what happens? And so, I mean, that it is getting more evolved and more complex now. And it's more about information and cybersecurity than it is just not falling for, that 1 letter's off in the email domain that's asking you to take a load. So,
I mean, if you'd have asked me, Samantha, when I joined DAT over 4 years ago, if we'd have hired a high power PhD CISO, right? If we needed that level of position, like beside like blocking and tackling of security, I'd have thought like, what? We're a load board, like a little kitschy load board company. Well, why do we need a CISO, let alone someone with a PhD and decades of experience, in fintech solving cybercrime? But we do now. Yeah. Like we needed to go do that, and the difference has been amazing, right? Like she comes in and it's just like, holy cow. Like the difference that you can make. And I think it's forcing a lot of companies to get better.
Yeah.
We're going to have to get better. The threats are evolving, and these people come to work every day, just like our software development teams. That was eye-opening to me. They walk into an office, a really nice office in let's just say Eastern Europe. They clock in, they open up their Jira instance, and they're working a list. Instead of creating new features on the load board or on your brokerage platform, they're saying, I'm going to go try to infiltrate these accounts and then hack into DAT or Truckstop or Robinson Go or Coyote Go or something like that. And that's what they do. This isn't like some seedy basement operation.
Right.
These are organized, and it's scary. It's genuinely scary.
They're getting a paycheck for those efforts.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Direct deposit.
You catch the first scam and they're already on to the second and third before you recognize that the first one's even happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. It's a scary, they've definitely turned focus onto our industry, and we need to up our game to combat it.
Okay, a couple other questions real quick, guys. I think we had one earlier in the show. I wanted to ask if anyone had thoughts on it. If the longshoremen strike on East Coast, I believe that will drive OTR mid-mile rates faster than interest rates might. So do we have any thoughts on the potential for a strike on the East Coast? And then would that have any effect on OTR rates?
Could we have a strike? Absolutely. The type of effect would really be dependent on how long it is, type of thing. I mean, if it'd be a day or two, it wouldn't have that much of an effect. If it was substantially longer, then certainly, yes, it would. That's why I do think we have seen some front loading of imports right now. I mean, we've had too many importers acknowledge that. We'll just have to wait and see. But again, something like this isn't what changes the entire market. I think one of the key things we just have to center ourselves with is basically take June of 2020 through about March of 2022 and forget it ever happened, because we shouldn't generalize from that once in hopefully a century period and think more about the fundamentals of what's changed things. We had a West Coast port strike in January of 2015, right around that period, and that didn't change the freight market. So it's worth considering.
I'll be interested to see what happens with the East Coast, just because every other potential scenario we had for strike ended up being resolved prior to a strike in the last couple of years. And so we're thinking like West Coast, even we're thinking rail, I believe Germany and like some ports in Europe avoided it as well. And so it's been a lot of like the unions really using their negotiation power and holding their ground. And then ultimately there's been concessions made to avoid a strike. So I don't know. I'm a little like worn out from we're going to have strikes, and then there never was. That to be a little more optimistic, to think that there might be resolution here. But I also think that the market's different and the leverage is different right now too.
It's an election year too. It's a bad optics in an election year to have a port strike. And if they quelled the railroad thing through legislative action, they're I don't.
Okay.
I
think we're all kind of in agreement that it would be surprising to see it progress to an actual strike. One last question. I know we might have a couple of you guys here who have a little bit of a pulse on the LTL side. But I know the LTL industry has a history of being very disciplined on pricing, but with almost every large national carrier now carrying between 20 to 30% excess network capacity and the weak truckload rates likely taking a little share, how confident are you that pricing will be up next year? And I think he's saying in the LTL space.
I'm looking back historically. The only times LTL prices have ever went down year over year were 2015. That is primarily fuel surcharge, because diesel had fallen. Early or mid 2020, that's mostly fuel surcharge. And then 2023, because 2022 is just insane. Right now, the latest PPI is up 6% year over year. Unless we go into a really deep freight recession, those rates are not going to come down. They're you're not going to have deflation in LTL. It just doesn't work that way.
I mean, speaking from experience, when I negotiated LTL contracts with Fortune 500s, I mean, I would say that standard increases are going to come out. The bigger guys are going to use their weight to push those down, maybe to a more nominal percentage increase. But I've almost never seen an LTL carrier fail to get some type of an increase every year, even if it's a smaller one. So I wouldn't necessarily anticipate that there would be nothing of note there. There's going to be something. There always is, I guess, is my opinion.
I got to jump. Thanks for having me, Samantha.
Thanks, Ken. I think we've covered most of the questions. I wanted to make sure. Push for continued negotiations. Yep. Okay. Well, if anyone else listening back to this has questions about anything that was discussed, please feel free to still leave a comment, tag us, tag whoever maybe said something that you thought was interesting and you had a question on. These guys will be happy to jump back in comments and answer questions for anyone. Or also you can connect with all of these gentlemen on LinkedIn. They've all been tagged in the event. So feel free to send them a connection request and reach out to them with any further questions. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. This was awesome. We'll have to do it again sometime. I'm sure we will. So maybe an end of year update is in our future, but thank you so much for being here. And thank you to the audience for meeting us for coffee.
Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.